Let me tell you something that no one warns you about. When you love from a place of fear, it becomes a trap. You chase, you try harder, you explain yourself again and again, hoping this time they'll understand, this time they'll change. But here's the paradox. It's not in the trying that things change. It's in the moment you stop, when you finally say, I choose me. That's when the avoidant starts to feel the absence they were running from. It's not because they suddenly grew emotionally mature overnight. It's because your absence makes them confront the very feelings they've been avoiding. When you detach, not from spite, but from clarity, you break a cycle. You stop feeding the dynamic that kept you stuck, and in doing so, you force them to face what they lost. That's when they realize, not when you begged, not when you waited, but when you finally stepped into your worth and chose peace over chaos. The avoidant only feels safe reflecting when the anxious finally lets go. This dynamic plays out in countless relationships where one person is constantly trying to hold things together while the other person seems to be pulling further away. At first glance, it feels confusing. You might think, why do they only seem to think about us after I walk away? But it's not just about timing, it's about safety. The avoidant, by nature, is uncomfortable with emotional intensity. They often grew up in environments where vulnerability wasn't nurtured or was even punished. As a result, when someone shows them deep emotional need, their reflex is to retreat. They don't necessarily understand why, but something about the closeness starts to feel threatening. It's not that they don't care, it's that they haven't learned how to stay present in emotional discomfort. Now, pair that with someone who has an anxious attachment style. The anxious person, driven by a fear of abandonment, tends to amplify their emotions when they sense distance. They reach out more, try harder, ask more questions, seek more validation. They may even start bending themselves into knots trying to understand what went wrong, even when they've done nothing wrong at all. This creates a cycle. The more the anxious person reaches out, the more the avoidant withdraws. And the more the avoidant withdraws, the more the anxious person panics and doubles down. It's emotionally exhausting, not just for the anxious person, but also for the avoidant, who starts to feel overwhelmed, even cornered. But here's where it gets interesting. When the anxious person finally lets go, truly lets go, not as a tactic to get a reaction, but because they've reached a place where they're emotionally done, that's when everything shifts. The avoidant suddenly has space. Space not filled with messages, questions, emotional appeals, or guilt. Just silence. And in that silence, something happens that couldn't happen before. They begin to reflect, not out of pressure, not because someone is making them confront their actions, but because they finally feel like they're not being chased. The absence of emotional demand creates a kind of vacuum. And in that vacuum, they can finally feel the weight of what they lost. Avoidants tend to feel more in control when they're the ones creating distance. But when the anxious person chooses distance, not out of manipulation, but out of self-preservation, the dynamic turns. The avoidant is now left with the echo of what used to be constant emotional noise. And in that echo, they often realize that what they ran from wasn't danger, it was connection, it was love, it was intimacy. But it's only in the absence of that energy that they feel safe enough to admit it, because reflection requires stillness. And avoidants rarely feel still when they're being emotionally pursued. They mistake pursuit for pressure and pressure for danger, so they shut down, close off, and retreat. But when you stop running after them, when you stop explaining, fixing, and waiting, they're left with their own thoughts. And those thoughts can be loud. Suddenly, they're asking themselves questions they never considered before. Was she really too much? Or was I just afraid of needing someone? Was he really clingy? Or was I just terrified of letting someone see me fully? These are questions that don't arise in the middle of conflict. They arise in the quiet. When there's no one there to absorb their avoidance, they have to confront it for themselves. It's uncomfortable, often painful, and usually unexpected. Because when they pulled away, they may have assumed you'd always be there. They didn't expect the anxious person to finally stop. That's the moment the avoidant begins to understand what they were too emotionally armored to see before. Not because you explained it perfectly, not because you cried or pleaded or fought to stay, but because your absence made them look inward instead of outward. This isn't about playing games or reverse psychology. It's about energetic patterns. When the anxious person lets go, they remove the emotional urgency from the connection. That absence is what allows the avoidant to feel like they can finally breathe. And once they can breathe, they can finally feel. Emotional distance creates the space avoidants need to feel their own regret. This is something that seems counterintuitive, especially to someone with an anxious attachment style. When you're anxious, the instinct is to fix things quickly, to talk it out, to get reassurance, to stay emotionally close in order to feel safe. So the idea of creating emotional distance feels like giving up or even self-sabotaging. But what actually happens is that the emotional intensity of constant closeness, especially closeness that demands attention, validation, or clarity, can overwhelm someone with avoidant tendencies. They don't process emotions the same way. While the anxious person is trying to close the gap, the avoidant person is feeling like they're being emotionally smothered. It's not that they don't feel things, it's that they don't feel safe feeling them in the moment. Their system is wired to retreat from intensity, not engage with it. Avoidants often live in emotional survival mode. They've trained themselves to disengage from discomfort, to detach when things start to feel too close, and to minimize their own emotional needs. This becomes a coping mechanism. So when they're in a dynamic with someone who's emotionally expressive, someone who wants to talk about things and work through feelings in real time, it can trigger all sorts of internal alarms. Their instinct is to run, not necessarily physically, but emotionally. They pull back, they go quiet, they distract themselves, and often they don't even fully understand what's happening inside them. They just know they need space, and quickly. But when that emotional space is constantly filled by the anxious partner trying to reconnect, their system never settles enough to reflect. They stay in that defensive state, avoiding both the situation and their own emotional accountability. It's only when emotional distance is truly created that the avoidant has room to feel what they were pushing away. And this distance can't be manufactured by simply waiting a few hours before texting or pretending not to care. The kind of emotional distance that creates real reflection comes when the anxious partner finally lets go, not out of manipulation, but because they genuinely reach a point of clarity where they are no longer willing to carry the emotional burden alone. That energetic shift, where the emotional pursuit stops, creates a vacuum. The avoidant is no longer defending themselves against someone else's emotions, which gives them the rare opportunity to sit with their own. In that quiet, something starts to happen. The distractions they use to avoid their emotions, work, social media, surface-level interactions, don't quite hit the same. The space feels different. It's not just peaceful, it's lonely. It's not just freedom. It's empty. And slowly, thoughts start creeping in. They replay moments that didn't seem significant at the time. They remember things you said, the look on your face during the last conversation, the silence that followed. These memories, which they previously brushed aside or minimized, now start to carry emotional weight. That's how regret starts to form, not when someone is actively trying to make them feel bad, but when they're left alone long enough to truly see what they've done and what they may have lost. Avoidants don't process emotion in real time the way anxious people do. Their emotional processing is often delayed. That's why they can seem so indifferent right after a fight or even a breakup. They appear cold, detached, sometimes even relieved. But over time, as the emotional intensity fades and their nervous system calms down, there's room for deeper emotions to come through. Guilt, sadness, confusion, and yes, regret. And regret doesn't just come from missing someone, it comes from realizing they played a role in pushing away someone who cared. But they can only access that realization when the emotional energy around them is still, when there's no one asking them to explain, no one pulling for reconciliation, no emotional noise demanding their attention, just space. And in that space, they start to feel. This isn't about punishing the avoidant or withdrawing love to teach a lesson. It's about understanding that emotional clarity for them only comes in the absence of pressure. While the anxious person seeks closeness to soothe their fear, The avoidant needs distance to regulate theirs. The tragedy is that these two needs often conflict, creating cycles where neither person feels seen or safe. But when the anxious person steps back, not as a strategy, but as a way to protect their own peace, it unintentionally gives the avoidant something they never knew they needed: room. Room to think, to feel, and to process what just happened without needing to defend themselves against someone else's emotional waves. That's the point where genuine self-reflection begins for them. Not because they're being told how to feel or what they did wrong, but because the emotional fog finally clears and they're left to sit in the reality of their own choices. Choosing self-respect over chasing awakens new dynamics in the relationship. For someone with an anxious attachment style, the need to feel secure in love can often override the instinct to protect their dignity. It's not intentional, and it's not weakness. It's a survival response. When emotional connection feels at risk, their first move is to get closer, to seek reassurance, to do whatever it takes to close the emotional distance. But in that process, they sometimes forget the most important relationship of all, the one they have with themselves. When chasing becomes a pattern, it sends a subtle message. I'm willing to ignore how I'm being treated if it means I get to keep you. Over time, that message isn't just received by the other person, it gets internalized. The anxious person begins to believe that this is the cost of love. That closeness always comes at the expense of self-worth. But there's a shift that happens when you stop chasing and start choosing self-respect. It's not loud. It doesn't come with ultimatums or dramatic declarations. It happens quietly, sometimes after a long night of crying, or yet another conversation that left you feeling small. It's a moment of emotional exhaustion that turns into clarity. You realize that no matter how much you try to show up, love that requires you to shrink isn't love you want to hold on to. And when that realization hits, something inside you begins to recalibrate. You stop calling just to fill the silence. You stop bending your needs to keep peace. You stop running after someone who only looks back when they think they're losing you. It's not an act of rebellion. It's an act of coming home to yourself. That energetic shift is powerful. When you choose self-respect, the dynamic that was once driven by imbalance starts to shake. The avoidant, who may have grown accustomed to emotional pursuit, begins to feel a change in the air. The emotional pull they once resisted is gone. They're not being texted first anymore. They're not being asked if everything is okay. They're not being emotionally managed or chased. And for someone who was used to that dynamic, it can be disorienting. What they once saw as pressure is now silence. What they once saw as too much is now gone. And in that space, they're forced to engage with the relationship in a new way, one where they're no longer in control of the emotional tempo. The beauty of choosing self-respect is that it shifts your focus away from what you're not getting and onto what you're no longer willing to tolerate. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop sacrificing your emotional well-being to be chosen by someone else. That kind of inner grounding changes your energy. You're no longer negotiating your value based on someone's availability. You start showing up differently. You communicate with more clarity, more boundaries, more conviction. And whether the relationship continues or ends, that transformation ripples through every interaction. People feel it, especially the avoidant partner who now has to confront a version of you that is no longer willing to dance the same dance. Avoidants often operate within relationships from a place of assumed pursuit. They expect the other person to be the emotional anchor, the one who does the repairing, the explaining, the waiting. But when that stops, when the anxious person stops anchoring and starts rising, they have to reckon with a version of the relationship where emotional labor is no longer one-sided. That's when things begin to shift, not always instantly and not always smoothly, but it's in that moment of imbalance where the anxious person stops over-functioning, that the avoidant finally feels the weight of what they've left unaddressed, sometimes for the first time. This isn't about making the avoidant suffer or turning the tables in some kind of emotional power play. It's about finally choosing to relate from a place of equality, not desperation. When you choose self-respect, you send a clear signal, not just to the other person, but to yourself, that you're no longer willing to be emotionally breadcrumbed. You're not chasing clarity, affection, or presence. You're choosing peace, and that choice changes the entire rhythm of the connection. It interrupts patterns that were silently reinforcing dysfunction. It reclaims emotional ground that was slowly being eroded by unreciprocated effort. And in doing so, it redefines what love feels like, not just for the other person, but for you. The anxious person's detachment disrupts the avoidance power pattern. In many avoidant anxious dynamics, there's an unspoken rhythm that gets established early in the relationship. The anxious person is typically the emotional initiator. They're the one reaching out first, asking the hard questions, trying to resolve conflict, keeping the connection alive when it starts to feel uncertain. The avoidant, on the other hand, often takes the position of emotional distance. They withhold, retreat, deflect, and although it might not be intentional, this positioning creates an emotional imbalance that reinforces a subtle power dynamic. The avoidant gets to regulate closeness on their terms, while the anxious person spends their energy trying to adapt, respond, and maintain the bond. Over time, this imbalance becomes exhausting. It starts to feel like the avoidant holds all the emotional control, not because they are more emotionally intelligent, but because they stay just out of reach. That distance becomes their leverage. The more the anxious person reaches out, the more the avoidant feels they can take space without consequence. They may not consciously think of it as power, but the dynamic gives them the freedom to stay emotionally uninvolved without risking the connection. They know, even subconsciously, that if things feel tense or if they disappear for a bit, the anxious person will come looking for them. They'll be the one to break the silence, send the text, initiate the conversation, ask to talk. That certainty gives the avoidant the upper hand. And it's not necessarily malicious. It's just the pattern that has formed, based on both people's emotional blueprints. But when the anxious person finally detaches, not out of anger, not to manipulate, but because they can no longer hold both sides of the emotional connection, that power pattern begins to collapse. Detachment, when it's real and rooted in self-awareness, is one of the most powerful shifts in the anxious-avoidant dynamic. It doesn't come with yelling or final warnings. It's quieter than that. It's when the anxious person stops over-explaining themselves, stops checking in constantly, stops offering emotional safety to someone who isn't reciprocating it. It's when their nervous system finally says enough, not because they've stopped loving, but because they've started preserving. That detachment isn't a strategy, it's a boundary, and that boundary interrupts the cycle the avoidant has become so used to. Suddenly, the person they expected to always be there has stopped showing up in the same way. The emotional space they once felt in control of is now empty. There's no message to respond to, no need to defend, no pressure to manage, just the stark silence of someone who has removed themselves from the emotional equation. That silence isn't just unsettling, it's disruptive. The avoidant is now confronted with the absence of emotional pursuit, and that absence forces them to look at themselves in a new way. They can't rely on the anxious person's consistent reassurance to stabilize the relationship anymore. And for someone who has always felt safer with distance, this shift is confusing. They may start to wonder what changed. Where did the energy go? Why does it suddenly feel like the connection is no longer on standby, waiting for them to re-engage when they're ready? That lack of emotional availability from the anxious partner disrupts their sense of control. It destabilizes the pattern that allowed them to avoid vulnerability without consequence. This disruption is important because it creates the possibility for a different kind of relationship dynamic. One that isn't fueled by one person constantly proving their worth, while the other person decides when and how much to engage. For the avoidant, this shift can be an uncomfortable wake-up call. It can stir the very feelings they've been trying to avoid all along: fear of loss, regret, emotional accountability. And while those emotions can be hard to face, they're also necessary. Because as long as the avoidant remains in a position of emotional power, there's no motivation to change. But when that power is disrupted, When the emotional safety net they've relied on is no longer there, they have to start asking different questions. They have to confront the ways they've participated in the disconnect, the ways they've relied on someone else to do the emotional work for both of them. The anxious person's detachment doesn't just create space, it creates a mirror. It forces the avoidant to look at the dynamic without the usual distractions or defenses. And in that mirror, they begin to see the impact of their emotional unavailability. Not because someone is pointing it out to them, but because the loss of that emotional closeness now feels real. The pattern has been broken. The script no longer plays the same way. And when the script changes, the people in the story have to change too. The dynamic that once allowed one person to keep running while the other kept chasing is now undone. The chase has stopped, and with it, the illusion of control. Healing begins when the anxious person chooses self-worth over proving their value. For so long, the anxious individual has been conditioned to believe that love must be earned, that affection is something to be worked for, and that being chosen comes after showing enough loyalty, enough patience, enough emotional availability. This mindset creates a dangerous cycle. When love feels uncertain, they double down. When someone pulls away, they get closer. When they feel ignored, they try harder. But all of this effort, all of this energy spent trying to be enough, doesn't lead to peace. It leads to depletion. The anxious person finds themselves emotionally drained, constantly waiting for scraps of reassurance, holding on to moments of connection like lifelines. And every time they are overlooked or emotionally sidelined, it reinforces the belief that they have to do more to be loved. But something transformative happens when the anxious person stops trying to earn their place and starts to embody their worth. It doesn't happen all at once. It usually comes after a moment of deep emotional pain, when the chasing becomes too exhausting, when the silence they've been trying to fill starts to echo back louder than their own voice. It's in that moment that a quiet shift begins. They stop seeing themselves as someone who has to win love and begin to see themselves as someone who deserves it by default. That shift isn't arrogant and it isn't defensive, it's a return to truth. And in that return, the anxious person begins to heal. Healing doesn't mean shutting down or becoming cold. It means realigning with the understanding that you are not required to abandon yourself to be chosen by someone else. It means recognizing that love built on the foundation of self-betrayal will never feel safe, no matter how hard you try to make it work. For the anxious person, this healing often starts with small moments. They stop apologizing for expressing their needs. They stop accepting half-hearted effort. They stop waiting for someone to finally wake up and see their value. Instead, they begin to walk away from dynamics where they are constantly proving and into spaces where they can simply be. When this shift happens, the avoidant partner often doesn't know how to respond. They were accustomed to the anxious person always reaching out, always being emotionally available, always making room for the disconnection. But now that emotional cushion is gone. And in its place is a person who no longer ties their value to the emotional response they receive. The anxious partner becomes more grounded. They're no longer reactive to the avoidant's distance, no longer anxiously seeking validation in every message or interaction. They begin to self-regulate. They begin to respond instead of react. And that new energy doesn't just protect them, it confronts the avoidant with a different version of intimacy.